call with Polar Bears International, and we are coming to you again live from Tundra Buggy 1 on the shores of Hudson Bay. We have a polar bear sleeping just behind us out here, and we saw quite a bit of polar bear activity this morning around the Tundra Buggy Lodge, and we're really excited to be here with you guys today to talk to you a little bit about what's going on here, but also about keeping animals safe, which is our title today. And we'll get to what that means pretty shortly, but first I want to introduce you to our awesome panel that we have out here. We have a few experts with us that are out this week for Polar Bear Week. So don't forget that November 1st to 7th is Polar Bear Week, and there's lots of exciting stuff going on. We've got a petition that you can sign. We have actions you can take for polar bears. We've got lots of exciting segments with all these great people and more this week. And we've got a ton of social media out there, so you can follow us at Polar Bears on Twitter. You can look at our Instagram at Polar Bears International, find us on Facebook, and follow explore.org all week. And thank you to explore.org for being an amazing partner and allowing this to happen. But before we go too much farther, let's let you know who these awesome people are. Maybe Cassie, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Elisa. Hi everybody, I'm Cassie Siegel, and I'm an environmental lawyer, and I work with a conservation group called the Center for Biological Diversity, and I run our Climate Law Institute, and I do projects to protect species like the polar bear that are threatened by global warming and to reduce greenhouse gas pollution, and I'm thrilled to be up here this week with Polar Bears International.
Thank you so much. Dr. Don.
Hi everybody, I'm Don Moore. I'm a senior scientist with Smithsonian's National Zoo and Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And I'm very happy to be up here again this year talking about climate change and polar bears and what we can do to help polar bears and the Arctic ecosystem.
Thanks so much, Don. And Andy DeRoche, who is my graduate studies supervisor, is also up this week.
Well, hi everybody. I'm Andy DeRoche. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada, and I've been studying polar bears across the Arctic for about, actually more than 30 years now. So I actually started studying this population for my graduate degrees years and years ago. So great to be with you today.
Great, thank you everybody. And just a reminder, if you have any questions for our panelists today, explore.org is watching the comment section of the Tundra Buggy Cam and the Tundra Connections Cam. So plunk your questions in there and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And in fact, maybe before we launch into the meat of the discussion today, let's take a question because we already have quite a few coming in. And Andy, I'm going to ask this one to you. How are the number of polar bears you're seeing compared to previous years? Has there been any dramatic decrease in the numbers of polar bears?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the Churchill population, it's actually formerly called the Western Hudson Bay population. And the boundary for this one goes north of us and quite a ways south to the neighboring province in Ontario. But the core monitoring area is between the Churchill Rivers the Churchill River and the Nelson River, which is south of us quite a ways here. And that's the core of the denning area for this population. So this is where most of the cubs are born. Most of the bears that we see out here were born in that area. And when I started here 30 years ago, there were about 1,200 bears in that core area. Now we're just a little over 800 bears. So we've lost about 30% of the bears in this area. Mm-hmm. And why do we think that's happening? We attribute it to changes in the sea ice, and that just means that the bears aren't getting as many seals in a year, and that means fewer cubs are born, and that just means there's fewer bears here.
It's a pretty simple equation for polar bears.
It's not complicated. Sea ice is what they need.
Right. And so maybe just to briefly tie into that, the second question is approximately how many polar bears are left, and how do we come to that number?
Well, in a global context, we don't have really good estimates of how many bears are in the whole Arctic because it's a huge area. We have some populations where we have really good data, like the one here in Churchill, Manitoba. Another one that we monitor very carefully is over in Alaska and is shared with Canada in the southern Beaufort Sea. That population is down about 40%. So it depends on where, but we've also got 19 populations in total across the circumpolar Arctic. Some of them are doing very well, incredibly abundant and business as usual for those bears, at least for now. We say there's somewhere around 20 to 25,000 bears in the circumpolar Arctic. There's still lots of polar bears out there, but the problem is what we're really concerned about is what the future holds for them. So we've got some populations declining, some stable, a couple might be actually increasing, but what we look at is sort of the 36 to 45 years future in time, and that's where we get very concerned because the sea ice is going to change and has changed a lot in the past decades, but we're really concerned about what the future holds for the bears.
Thanks, Andy. And we're not only concerned about polar bears, there's quite a few different wildlife species around the world that are also seeing changes in habitat or other things that are affecting their populations. And there's many different programs around the world that work to save endangered species, conserve habitats. One of these programs is called the SAFE program, and Dr. Moore, I'm going to ask you a little bit about this program, and it actually doesn't involve polar bears, but it involves some pretty interesting animals that I think our viewers would love to hear about. Can you tell us a little bit about what the SAFE program is and what animals are involved in it?
Sure. So SAFE is Saving Animals from Extinction, and it's a new program for the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. There are 230 accredited zoos and aquariums in North America and around the world. And our focus is on conservation and education. And the SAFE program is designed to kind of define the playing space, the best niche for zoos to operate for conservation. And so, for instance, we're working with African penguins, and we facilitated a meeting of all African penguin stakeholders, all the different conservation programs, groups, and management groups that are concerned with African penguins, and we defined all of the needs that the African penguins have and decided where zoos could best play a role in helping them, like in education about sustainable fisheries or in veterinary care for oiled African penguins. For polar bears, we think that our best playing space is in conservation education and talking about climate change and how the public can help with climate change so that we conserve the Arctic habitat for the future and we conserve polar bears in that way.
Interesting. Now, Don, with the penguins, I have a note to ask you about something to do with guano and nest boxes.
Oh,
Can you
yes.
tell that story?
Yes, so African penguins, sadly, are endangered because humans are overfishing the oceans and we've overharvested guano for fertilizer. And it turns out, as disgusting as this might be for our viewers, that African penguins have been nesting in these big piles of guano that are almost like earth, and they've accumulated over years and years. But the result of nesting in guano is that these nests are insulated from that South African harsh sunlight. And so now the penguins don't have much to eat. They have to go farther into the sea to fish, and they don't have many nesting habitats. So the idea about nesting habitat is that if it's reduced, you can provide artificial nests. We've done it in North America for wood ducks. We do it for our songbirds in our backyards. And so for African penguins, we would provide these artificial nests. But we need to get the temperature and the humidity correct inside the nests. And the unique role that zoos can play in these nest boxes, these artificial nest boxes, is to test different kinds of nest boxes. Maybe, I don't know, like Coleman refrigerators that we take on a picnic, and penguins could choose those as nest boxes, and they would be insulated against the heat of the sun. So the zoos are doing that science now, and dozens of zoos are involved in this. And then maybe we have 180 million visitors a year to accredited zoos and aquariums, and maybe those visitors can play a role by donating more nest boxes. Then we'll send them over to South Africa to kind of boost the population of African penguins.
Oh, that's pretty fun.
Okay,
Yeah.
so one thing. Not everybody knows the word guano. So
Yeah.
what's
Guano.
guano?
Guano is bird poop.
Bird
And
poop,
so piles and
exactly.
piles and piles of bird poop over hundreds of years makes a very stable kind of, I don't want to call it soil because we use it for fertilizer, but it's a very interesting structure, and the penguins can burrow into that and nest in there. But it's hundreds of years worth of bird poop. Yes.
That's
well
Thank
put.
you for correcting. And I just want to say, because we're talking about penguins while we're talking about polar bears, I just want everybody to remember that penguins occur in the southern hemisphere, and there's an equator that's very hot, and the penguins normally don't go north of there unless they're going into a zoo or an aquarium. And polar bears, of course, occur here at the top of the world, the northern hemisphere, and the only way that they actually see each other is in major soda commercials.
That's pretty funny. And Explore.org has some pretty awesome penguin camps too, actually. So our viewers
Yeah.
can go from polar bears to penguins if they're in the mood for both one day. So thanks, Don.
Sure.
Cassie, I wanted to, so we've kind of talked about some things humans are doing to protect animals, and there's those kind of measures. There's also some different policy measures that people can take. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Endangered Species Act and the effect that that has had on some animal populations around the world, or your views on it.
Absolutely. So the Endangered Species Act is our law in the United States, which is actually the world's strongest and most successful protection for plants and animals on the brink of extinction. And the way it works is the law protects plant or animal once it's listed as threatened or endangered, and endangered is the category of most imperilment. And once a species is added to that list, which interestingly any person or any organization, like my own for example, can petition the government to add a species to the list. And once it's formally listed, it gets very strong protections. And it's been incredibly successful. Over 99% of species that have been added to the list so far have been saved from extinction, and over 90% right now are actually doing better. They're recovering, is the word that's used, doing better than when they were listed. One of the things a species gets is a recovery plan, where scientists and managers get together and make a plan for the things that need to be done to get that species on the right track. And one of the big projects I worked on was Endangered Species Act listing for polar bears. We petitioned in 2005, and they were actually added as a threatened species in 2008, the first mammal to be ever listed due solely to the threat of climate change.
And that's a pretty amazing feat, because I think it's easier for humans to maybe look at habitat, say a forest that's being cut down, or human development that is encroaching. But when it's something like the climate change and it's greenhouse gas emissions that are really causing the loss of habitat, it's not as easy for our eyes to see that happening. So to be able to get a listing for that, I think, is really incredible. And in that vein, there's a question for you that has come in. Cassie, do you find that industries and businesses that are huge contributors to pollutants have started paying more attention to how their activities affect climate change and therefore animal, environment, and living conditions? Are you seeing a shift?
I think we are. I think we're seeing a lot of growing awareness among a lot of businesses, and a lot of businesses banding together to do really good things for the environment by changing their own practices, and also by supporting really strong government policies to make things better. At the same time, there are, of course, probably many viewers know, many industries, fossil fuel companies amongst them, who are still fighting quite hard against a lot of things that we really need to do to solve this problem.
Excellent. And it is a problem that affects us all and not just polar bears, so it's nice to know that we're starting to see a shift. And we'll be talking more about this sort of thing throughout Polar Bear Week, including a segment about what's happening in Paris at the climate talks, so stay tuned for that. Right now, we're getting, I think there's a lot of excitement that we have a big polar bear biologist here, as there should be. So I think I'm going to launch into a few just polar bear biology questions for you, Andy, if you're ready.
Just to be clear, not all polar bear biologists are big. I just happen to be a large version. So,
Well, there you
anyways, go ahead.
All right, so let's start with, what is a polar bear's strongest sense? Sight, hearing, or smell?
It's definitely sense of smell. I mean, these bears are, and actually all bears work with their sense of smell. It's really how they find where they want to be. We think they use it for navigation, but most definitely they're using it to find the things that they want to eat, which is mainly ring seals and bearded seals. They also use their sense of smell to find mates. So in the sea ice, you have to think this is pretty much a featureless landscape. There's no landmarks to work from. So if you're out there and you're wandering around, and how are you going to find a mate and a female that's in breeding condition? If you're a big male and you're looking for a female, you actually smell the footprints. And when you're out on the sea ice and you see a bear cross these tracks, it's just they'll go on them and they'll go for a few steps and then they'll make a decision. Follow the tracks or just keep going, because that's not a female. So that's the scent that really makes a polar bear tick. And so when you look at a polar bear, one of the things you see is their skulls are actually longer than brown bears or grizzly bears. And part of the reason we think is if you want to really build up that sense of smell, you have to have more space in your brain for those parts of the brain that are associated with smell. So it's the same reason why wolves have a long nose too for smell, and foxes and a lot of those sorts of species. And polar bears definitely are working off their sense of smell.
Interesting. And
can I ask a question there though? So actually 3. So can you compare a bear sense of smell to a dog's? Number 1. Number 2, we had a little problem here on the buggy this morning, and we had guys on the ground, and there was a polar bear coming in, and from a pretty far distance, I saw that polar bear looking. I thought it was looking, not scenting. So can you comment on their vision? And then third, I know San Diego Zoo has done actual hearing studies in a soundproof chamber, and we know something more about their sense of hearing.
Yeah, okay. Well, first off, I mean, all of the dog family have a very good sense of smell.
Yes.
So, you take your dog for a walk, and it's darn clear that they're living in a different world than we do. I mean, everything smells and has that sort of, interest for them. It's hard to compare these because we haven't done the controlled experiments. So people always say, well, how far away can a polar bear smell a seal? And some people say, you'll read in the literature, it says, 20 kilometers or 15 miles or something. And it's just, it doesn't really help you that much because, right from where we are, there's lots of seals out in the ocean, but you want to be able to localize them. So it's not just the sense of smell that's important. It has to be very strong so that you can smell that there's a seal in the area, but then you need to localize it. And that's where they're certainly using their vision to localize where would a seal be, because a lot of the times the seals are under the snow, so you can't actually see them, particularly when female ring seals are giving birth to their pups. So it's under the snow, so now you have to use the structures that are out there to help you visualize where they are. So polar bears have what we call dichromatic vision, so they see differently than we do. We have what are called trichromatic vision. Mm-hmm. So we have 3 types of sensors. They have 2 sensors. Of course, you got to remember that polar bears live in a world that for many months of the year is dark. So they have much more sensitive eyes when it's very dark out, so they can see better what's going on. And so through the Arctic winter night, that's an important component.
And are they hunting during the night? That is actually
they are hunting during the night. How effective they are, it's hard to say. I would think we've had some amazing northern lights here. That would provide a bit of light, or moonlight. Certainly, it's like you let your dog out at night, and they're not worried about what's going on. They'll go walk around. They have much better sensory perception of what's going on visually. So it's a difference there. Now, what was the third question? Hearing, right.
Yep.
Well, it's certainly they have okay hearing, and we think probably when they're hunting, they probably are relying on hearing a little bit. But the problem is it's windy out here. And sea ice is actually noisy. It's you're walking around on snow and it's crunchy, and you've all walked on snow, or many of us have, and it's crunchy and the ice is grinding, and so it's not a really important component. But I'm guessing that if you are standing still and you're right over a seal lair and there might be a pup in there or a mother, you can probably hear her come out and scratch around moving, because they kind of use their claws to move, and they probably go, the seal is right there. And when you see a polar bear hunting and they jump up, they're trying to guess where the seal is or where the seal hole is so that they can close off the exit and then dig around and find dinner. So But number one, it's the sense of smell. There's no question.
And we noticed that yesterday too, and quite a few Explore viewers saw that if they were watching the cams. We had a very large male at the end of yesterday. He kind of had one droopy ear, some major scars on him. He is a polar bear that is definitely recognizable out here. A lot of them aren't, but we'll be able to know that guy again. And there was another smaller polar bear that was trying to kind of keep his distance. And we did see the big male sniffing that bear's footprints too, maybe just to get a sense of what was going on.
I think they kind of know who everybody is, or at least a lot of who's there. And you know, it's the sense of smell. It's like I can be coming home, and if the wind is going the right way, my dog knows that I'm coming home well before he can see me. And so I think, you know, he knows what I smell like, and I didn't think I smelled, but obviously I do to my dog. And so in that sort of sense, you know, bears, I think, probably do know each other. So when we see this play behavior where they come up to each other, if you watch them, they come up, and one of the first things they do is they sniff. And they sniff the bear. And I think what they're getting is two things. Who are you? Do I know you? Have we wrestled before? Did I lose last time, perhaps? Or it's also, I can probably smell, who else have you been wrestling with? So maybe I can smell that you are wrestling with that guy over there, and I know I can beat up that guy. So let's wrestle. I think I got a good chance with you. So we don't really know, but the sense of smell is so important for mammals that I would suspect that this is something that they're using. It would make sense from an evolutionary perspective to be using that information and using it to your advantage.
Interesting. So kind of in that maybe bear vein, and maybe I'll get you to chime in as well, Dawn and Andy. So the question is, while watching brown bears, panda bears, and polar bears, it seems that polar bears are the more social bears. Even though they live solitary lives, they don't seem to mind each other's presence or even interacting with one another out on the tundra. Why is that? What's going on with these bears?
Wow. So you want me to take like all bears first?
Yeah, go for all bears.
We really don't know a lot, I don't think, about the social nature of bears. So at National Zoo, we have giant pandas, which are native to China. They're bamboo eaters, and they go into the bamboo forests and then they disappear. We can't see them. They're, surprisingly, the big black and white stripes are very good camouflage, and we've just started studying them in their native habitat and maybe capturing their behaviors in their native habitat. Like Dr. DeRoche was saying, they have very good sense of smell throughout the bear family, so we suspect that they all know one another. They're long-lived, they're smart, and all the bears are smart. I happen to think that polar bears are the smartest species, maybe. But even the smallest, the sun bears that are frugivores, up to the sloth bears that are insectivores, they range and they look solitary, but there's a lot of smell stuff going on so that they all know one another. I have a lot of experience with black bears in state parks and national parks, and you know, when they go to a dump area or just a food concentration like a berry patch, it's pretty obvious that they're all acting socially, right? And they're not just individuals that don't know one another. Brown bears the same way. We see, you know, groups of brown bears on streams in Alaska, and they're all kind of interacting with that same kind of behavior that Dr. DeRoche was talking about, where they're smelling each other and maybe smelling where was the last place you were and who are you and things like that. So I tend to think that they're very, very social out here across all bear species, and we just haven't learned as much as we should know about these animals. We've been calling them solitary bears or solitary carnivores like tigers for a long, long time. But when you think about their olfactory senses and the fact that poop and pee both smell, and so do footprints, and they can smell all of that stuff and they leave that stuff across the landscape, there's a lot of information there that they can communicate that's not all about just seeing each other and direct talking. If that makes
So
sense.
here's just I mean, something people may not know, but giant pandas, why do they do a handstand?
To mark. So they do a handstand and they rub their butt up and down on something, and that marks it for the next giant pandas that are coming through. So they're all leaving markings somehow. We know about bear claws or bear claw markings on trees and other signposts out there, you know, in the habitat, and so they're all leaving marks for other bears, and they're looking for marks from other bears as they're moving through their habitat.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the important things to remember is basically we're monkeys, right? So we work with our faces, and I can communicate with you with my eyes and my smile and my teeth. But we have to be very close to each other when we communicate, because we gave up our sense of smell for the most part. So we don't communicate much with the sense of smell. Whereas bears are working on a different spatial scale, so space is different, and you can leave your smell everywhere. So you know who's there. So we talk about solitary, but it's because we think of solitary from the context of being big, not very hairy monkeys. But bears see the world very differently, and this is where it's important to also keep the context of where you are. So right now, there's no food on land for these bears. They can eat a bit of kelp, there's nothing really here. Maybe they'll get lucky and every so often find a seal to kill, but it's very rare. So there's not much here to eat. The mating season is long past, so there's no females to compete with. So one of the things you see with a lot of different species is if you aren't competing for resources, it's very energetically expensive to maintain that sort of I need to protect this sort of attitude or behavior, so they just drop it. The best thing to do right now is to just chill. Just relax, save the energy, wait till the ice comes back, and then you can go hunt. The other thing is these bears that sometimes on the coast here, we can get groups of 10 or 15 males all together in one little area, and they'll lie right next to each other like big, huge white puppies. They're really social. And then they'll wrestle and they'll play. They're very gentle with each other during that. It's very ritualized. Those same bears out on the sea ice, if there is a female in breeding condition, they will tear each other apart. They will break jaws. We've got a bear walking around here with a twisted jaw. That's probably from an interaction during the mating season. We quite regularly see bears with huge scars and cuts. That's from very serious interactions. They break their canines, and their canines are incredibly thick, and they snap them off when they come together and lock their jaws. So it's different times of the year, depends on the resources, and for the polar bears, it really is, there's a size hierarchy that comes into play here as well. So the bigger the bear you are, the more dominant you are, but it also depends on how old you are. And once you're slipping on the back edge there and not doing as well, that's sometimes you see those big old males, they look pretty tired out, and they've had their run at mating and they're on their way down.
Right. Wow.
And can I jump in again?
Yeah,
So
please.
I think you've seen groups of bears around big whales, right? And how do they act there in terms of dominance hierarchy?
Yeah, there's an interesting dominance hierarchy that's set up, but because in a whale, like if it's a dead bowhead sitting on a beach, don't bother. You can't protect it. There's nothing, no defendable resource, because there's enough for everybody, and everybody just gets in there. Of course, you have to, there are rules of organization, so to speak, in the bear world, and if you're a small bear, you're very careful of the big bears. But it's quite interesting that they relax, change their behavior. They're very adaptive animals in that respect.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Cassie, a couple questions have come in for you. So what are the consequences for business, industries, companies, and people, etc., who violate the Endangered Species Act?
Well, so a lot of the protections bears get are things that the government does to proactively help them. So it's government agencies and government scientists doing things. There are prohibitions, though, and the basic prohibition of the Endangered Species Act is that you can't, the technical word is take, and that's a pretty broad term. You can't kill a listed species or harm it or harass it. Have to basically leave them alone. And so if a person or a company, say, violates this by hurting an animal, there are fines that could be levied. You could also have a criminal prosecution for that. In reality, though, that actually, it's very, very rare that that happens. The law works very well to deter people from doing that. And one of the really big benefits is increased understanding about the plight of the species. So while there are, of course, circumstances where it happens, it's pretty rare. And I think actually sometimes the government is even a little bit too reluctant to levy those penalties in some extreme situations. But for the most part, it works pretty well.
Oh, thank you for that. We have a couple questions kind of in the climate change sense of things. So maybe Andy, you can start, and then I would love other input. One question is global warming the biggest threat to polar bears? And kind of in that vein, do we know of, if the sea ice melts, are there land-based food sources that polar bears could shift to kind of get through the global warming?
Well, as a polar bear scientist, when we look at the various threats, and there are other threats besides climate change, so we can look at pollution. Polar bears at the top of the food chain have quite high levels of pollution, and mercury levels, for example, are still increasing in the bears. But that's not threatening the bears. We have hunting in some parts of the Arctic, in Greenland, Canada, and Alaska. For the most part, that's fairly well managed. I'm not saying it's perfect. But it's not a threat to the population. It was back in the 1960s, but it's not a current threat. We have pretty good handle on that. We do have development. We have shipping and the potential for oil spills. Those are threats, but they haven't caused major problems for the bears yet. They could in the future. A major oil spill in polar bear habitat could be very serious on a population. The global threat to polar bears is definitely climate change, and it's just a habitat loss issue. As the Arctic is warming, and it's warming much faster than areas at lower latitudes, 2 to 3 times faster, we're changing the sea ice, and we're changing the primary habitat where polar bears live. So from that perspective, it's a real challenge to keep the bears in the future going forward. Right now, polar bears are doing okay in most areas, but some areas like here, they're going down in abundance. So we have some major concerns. So now the second part of the question
is the land-based foods.
Oh,
is that an
right,
option?
right. It's not. It doesn't work. And polar bears can be on shore, and sometimes you'll see them on the cameras here eating kelp, or inland they'll eat berries. Sometimes they'll find leftovers from a wolf kill. They eat those things because they're coming ashore with enough energy to get them through this ice-free period. So they bring with them fat from eating seal blubber out on the sea ice. They bring that on shore, and that's the energy that gets them through. Sure, they'll augment it with anything, goose eggs or whatever they can find. The problem is there's not enough terrestrial resources to support a population of bears in this area. There's not enough food on land. And one of the reasons we know what happens when the climate warms is we've kind of already done this experiment, because if you go back about 10,000-11,000 years ago, that was when the planet, we were at the end of an ice age, and the sea ice was much, much further south. So as far south as around the southern parts of Sweden and Denmark and the southern parts of Norway. So, and one of the things we know is we have very good fossil evidence of polar bears having been in that area. But as the climate warmed, and that's a natural warming, that was due to planetary physics, that warming meant that the ice disappeared, and the bears didn't stay there, become more terrestrial. They didn't mate with grizzly bears and create a new species, even though grizzly bears or brown bears live there. They moved northward with the ice and found appropriate habitats. The problem going forward is that we're going to keep warming and keep making that ice further and further north, and eventually there's just not going to be much space for the bears. So bears have what we call behavioral plasticity. They've always eaten this, and we can go right back to the very first explorers that came to North America. We know that they were eating great auks on some of the islands off of the coast of Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada. And the early explorers knew that. So it's not a new behavior. We're seeing it more often because the bears are on land more. But we think it's a transition period until those resources really aren't around, or there's not enough sea ice to hold on to the bears.
Did you have anything to add?
Well, a couple of things. So in the 1970s, the 5 polar bear nations got together and created the first international polar bear treaty, and that was to mitigate overexploitation of polar bears, and that's what I think we were most concerned about at the time. And in the 40 years since, we've become more and more concerned about climate change because the climate is warming so fast. When I first started coming up here, I was worried about overexploitation of polar bears, and frankly, if tourism was doing anything to the population of polar bears, which it doesn't have a measurable impact on the population, and also about emerging diseases. And emerging diseases are also about a changing climate. So if mosquitoes can make it farther up north, they can potentially bring, say, West Nile virus to polar bears, and some New World animals like flamingos and ravens and crows don't do well when they're exposed to an emerging old world virus like West Nile virus. We know that from zoo science, from pathology science. And so I guess what I would add is we need all hands on deck to help with this problem, to create solutions. And some of those hands on deck that we need are great wildlife veterinarians, great pathologists, great ecologists, and great scientists. And people who choose to not become scientists need to understand that scientists are people too, and we're just like you. We're not evil, and we try to tell the truth, but we also create space to have discussions and disagree with one another and find new science facts and to help the planet. And it's all about helping polar bears and helping the planet. So
Don, what are some of your favorite solutions for helping the planet?
Wow. Well, so I don't live up here. I visit up here, and I live down south by Washington, D.C. And so some of my solutions are I just try to reduce my greenhouse gas usage. So I still drive my car. I still go to work. I use less hot water in my shower and in everything that we do in the home. So instead of hot in our washing machine, we use warm cold. And so all of the housewives out there and people who actually do laundry get what I mean. And I'm also a locavore, so I proudly eat meat and support my local farmers, but I support my local farmers more than I support my friends who are farmers down in Argentina and Uruguay, where I also do some research. And I also grow my own food, and I make my own jam. And so I try to do a lot of stuff locally to help the planet, and I was raised to, always try to have clean water and clean air. And so whatever I do kind of contributes to clean water and clean air.
Oh, thank you. Cassie, do you have some favorite solutions or things that people can do from your perspective?
I do. I mean, all of those were great. And what we need to do to solve this problem for polar bears is transition to clean, renewable energy, and do that quite rapidly. And these are really satisfying things to do. So I live in the desert in Joshua Tree, California, so it's quite easy for us. We generate electricity with our photovoltaic panels. We have 100% of our hot water come from a hot water heating system, dry our clothes on the line, and compost our food scraps. Those things are real easy where we live. But we also need policy changes, and we're going to be talking about policy on our next webcast in a couple hours. And we have to get policies in place to shift the world over quickly. The good news is that we can do it. Stanford scientist Mark Jacobson and his project, the Solutions Project, has a roadmap for how we can get the entire United States to 100% renewable energy by 2050, make the world a safer, healthier place in the process, have a net job increase of about 2 million jobs. So it's very doable, and we'll be talking more about that later on.
Okay, thank you so much. Andy, do you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, I think one of the key sort of things that you can do about climate change is, number one, is you have to understand what the problem is. So you have to understand the issues that our climate is facing. So you have to be educated about the problems, and that means going to credible places to get that information, you can start at Polar Bears International on the webpage to get some insights about what's going on. But again, I'm an educator. I work in a university, so I teach about this. The science of climate change is absolutely profound. But what we're talking about is making changes that are the hardest changes to make, which is changing human behavior. There are simple things you can do. When I moved to teach at the university, I decided I want a house. I didn't want a big house. We live in a very small house. It's 1,000 square feet. There's 4 of us living in there. I can walk to work there. I'm quite lucky in that respect. Not everybody can. But I also worry that, when you're thinking about, well, we need a new house, you should be thinking about energy efficiency in that house. And how much space do you really need? So different parts of the world, we have a North American view, many of us, that we need this monster house, and our families have gotten smaller, but our cars have gotten bigger, and our houses have gotten bigger, and we have to go a different direction. So making smart purchasing choices is important. But in our home, we do many of the same things. We grow a lot of our own food as best we can. I live in Edmonton. It's a short summer. But we also compost in our house. We recycle a lot. We've also moved all of our bulbs either into compact fluorescence or LED bulbs to really reduce how much energy we're using. We've installed a smart thermostat that recognizes when there's nobody in the house, and it will turn down the temperature. We've dropped the thermostat in our house. We've turned down our hot water tank. So there's lots of small things, but the big things are you have to be informed, and then once you're informed, you have to tell your politicians that you want to see change. And so I'm always big. I tell my students at the university, I'm going to be fertilizer by the time you folks are really paying for the effects of climate change. And you really have to think that this current generation, people my age, should be paying some of the cost for the damage that has been done. And that means, I think, we're all going to have to pay a little bit more for everything we do, recognizing that creating carbon and releasing it into the atmosphere has a cost that we're not currently paying for, and past generations have to accept some of that burden.
Mm-hmm. And I think I heard you say, we've talked about it before, but 50 years from now, polar bears will not be our top priority. It's really going to be ourselves.
It's really the priorities will change, mm-hmm. and we have a window of time where if we make actions now, polar bears will benefit, but we're focusing on polar bears, but this is really a question about humanity. Mm-hmm. And people in very wealthy countries will probably deal with the issues better to some extent, but there are parts of the United States and Canada that are going to be severely challenged, and a large proportion of our gross domestic product will be dealing with the drama and the perils and the disasters that come from climate change. We're seeing little bits of it, droughts in California, and we're seeing droughts in the prairies, parts of where I live. The grain farmers got nothing off their crops because they just got no rain all summer, so the wheat crop just stunted in the fields. The rivers that we get our water from, the glaciers in the Rocky Mountains, are disappearing. Where are we going to get our water from? So the issues will change over time. Mm-hmm. Right now, and in this talk, we're talking about polar bears, but it is a much bigger issue down the road.
Mm-hmm. All of us have been working on polar bears for many years and calling the polar bear the canary in the coal mine, and the Arctic the Earth's early warning system, because the Arctic is warming at about twice the rate of the rest of the planet. And so if we can do the things that are necessary to slow warming enough to save the Arctic sea ice that the polar bear needs and save the polar bear, then we'll be doing the things we need to do to avoid the worst harms for the rest of the world as well. So we work on polar bears, I think, because like so many other people, we love these amazing animals. They are so worth saving for themselves. We would miss them so much if they're gone. But they're also an incredibly important species because the Arctic is actually has been acting as a cooling system for the rest of the planet, and we have to save the Arctic sea ice in order to be avoiding all these terrible things that could come if we just keep on going with business as usual with greenhouse emissions.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that there are a lot of people that are working on this and coming up with really great solutions, and I think young generations these days are, really into it. Dawn, could you told me a story last night about the kids that started their own no idling campaign at their school?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if I could tell that story.
Oh, perfect.
So, what Dr. DeRoche and Cassie just said makes it feel totally overwhelming. And I even have a very passionate conservationist friend at work who asked me just last week, have we gone past the tipping point? Do I really have to take action? And the answer is, yes, we have to take action. We have to take personal action. We have to take kind of collective action. And so this story about the kids in a school in Virginia is that they formed a green team, and they know that they have to take action. And they went to their principal. They had a story in the Washington Post about this about a year ago. And they went to their principal and they said, we need to turn off our lights. We need to have no idling. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Can we have kind of your authority, your blessing to go around to the school and maybe give tickets and talk to teachers about leaving their lights on when they leave the classroom and have them turn them off instead? Computers are on when people leave the classroom. Can we have them turn them off? So the principal said, yes, why don't you give out tickets? And that will inform them that they've left lights on, and you can do random checks, and then just give me copies. And so he started getting copies of these tickets that the students were giving out because they're so passionate about saving the environment. And there was no real penalty. It was just that he could talk to the teachers and say, you know what, you're leaving these lights on. And the big deal is now not only are they saving greenhouse gases, they've reduced their greenhouse gas emissions, but they're saving the school money. They're saving thousands and thousands of dollars by turning their lights off when they don't need to use them, and they're turning their computers off. So and if you're driving a car and you're sitting somewhere like at a food drive-through or just waiting for somebody to come out of a building, you can turn your car off instead of idling. So at the National Zoo, we have no idling rules. And in Washington, D.C. now, we have no idling rules because there's no reason to just sit there kind of spewing greenhouse gases into the environment if you're just waiting for somebody in a car or in a truck.
That's great. Well, thanks for sharing. It's really exciting to hear those neat solutions, and especially when it's kids. Polar Bears International, we have a similar program. Oh, that bear outside is being pretty darn cute. BJ just pulled that up for you. At PBI, one of the things that we do every year is the Project Polar Bear Contest, and that's where kids across the world, really, we have classrooms in Spain and India doing it. Kids get together in their school or community and they form some sort of team or project that the goal is to reduce their carbon emissions. And there's been some really awesome students that have done some really cool projects. One group a few years ago, they redesigned their town's school bus system and took a bus off the road. And we have amazing no idling campaigns and just all sorts of great stuff. So any teachers or students out there, I would encourage you to check out Project Polar Bear. And of course, during Polar Bear Week for the rest of the week, we'll be talking about ways to reduce your carbon emissions and help the polar bears. Our petition to instate a federal carbon tax is online. You can sign that. That's really exciting, and it also will be talked about during the COP21 segment we'll do later this week. And I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of your questions. There was a lot of awesome questions. I'm going to pull Andy aside later, and we're going to answer you in the comment box, or I'll type and you can talk. How about that?
That's a deal.
We have some cool polar bear questions that came in. And does anyone else have anything to say before we wrap up the hour? Well, good. Thanks for joining us today.
I think my ending comment would be there are places that you can go online to measure your carbon footprint, and I would encourage you and your family to do that. And then once you've measured your carbon footprint, it will tell you maybe some solutions that you can take to reduce your carbon footprint, and that's a really important thing to do.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Don. I'd also really like to thank our sponsors, of course, Explore.org, for helping us stream these polar bears right into wherever you are watching from right now. as well as Frontiers North Adventures, who donates Buggy 1 to us and lets us stay in the lodge during the week. It's a pretty cool setup out there. Lets us be surrounded by polar bears this entire week. We would also like to thank Parks Canada, who help us host the Cape Cams out at Cape Churchill. Some really awesome polar bear activity out there. All you sponsors are wonderful, and we couldn't do it without you. So thank you very much, and thanks to our panelists. You'll see more of them later this week. And thanks to our viewers for watching. And we'll see you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye
Bye.
for now.